My name is Sora Lin, granddaughter of Korean tailors and daughter of an invisible seamstress in the fashion industry. I grew up among fabrics piled in plastic bags, dusty threads, and silences that lasted far too long. I never imagined that one day I'd have to draw on all of that just to survive the most insidious professional attack of my life. I joined Harrow Vale as an intern at 22. Shy, hardworking, fresh out of a public university. At first, no one remembered my name, but I remembered everyone's. I paid attention. I noticed which combinations worked, the mistakes no one corrected, the forgotten processes behind every show that captivated the world. In no time, my backstage suggestions started getting results. Not out of vanity, but precision. And that's when he noticed me. Mark Halden was the production director for the haute couture line. Arrogant, charismatic, obsessed with control. He saw talent as a threat and silence as weakness. At first, he pretended to support me. He said things like, "Girls like you have raw potential." That, with a firm hand, I could go far. But what he really wanted was to shape my voice into a shadow. And when he realized I wouldn't play his game, he began what I can only describe as a silent demolition. It started with subtle exclusions. My name vanished from project credits. My ideas were presented by him, rewritten in different words. When upper management praised a design, he'd say he had polished the proposal. Gradually, others began seeing me as a technical piece, useful, but replaceable. I was the assistant who optimized spreadsheets and adjusted timelines, even when it was my curation that made entire collections work. But the worst part came on the day of the promotion. I had been informally considered for the product development manager role, a position just under his, but strategic. It was only a matter of time. The team's numbers, our performance under my leadership, everything pointed in the right direction. Then I got summoned to an HR meeting. Mark was there, sitting, arms crossed, with an enigmatic smile. "The company has decided to take a different path, Sora," he said, while the HR manager kept her eyes glued to the paper in front of her. "We're reallocating you to an external support unit in the prototyping division." It was a demotion, a disguised removal. And worst of all, the position that should have been mine went to someone he had recommended, a former grad school buddy who didn't even know how to sew. That day, I didn't cry. I went back to my new space, an improvised cubicle between mannequins and cutting boards, and sat in silence. But inside, something had shifted. For the first time, I realized I didn't need permission to fight back. I needed structure, strategy, and patience. That's when the story changed. I began documenting emails, decisions, and signed sketches. I started a side project, a database of production errors caused by Mark's changes. I gained access to reports he ignored on fabric waste, missed deadlines, bypassed suppliers. I organized everything into folders with screenshots, dates, and anonymous testimonies from seamstresses and pattern makers. At the same time, I used my new role as a shield. No one expected anything from this support unit, which gave me the freedom to visit factories, get close to the workers, and understand bottlenecks Mark never saw. Bit by bit, my vision expanded. I was no longer just part of the atelier. I now knew the weak points of the entire brand. Then, I secretly enrolled in an international leadership program focused on fashion management and textile innovation. At first, I studied late at night, after work shifts. I recorded lectures, summarized articles, simulated market reports, as if I were the CEO. No one knew, but I was preparing for something much bigger. And my chance came. It arrived in the form of a crisis. The company lost a $1 million contract with a European boutique chain. The reason? Delays in delivery, production errors, and poor logistics communication, all under Mark's watch. The board went on high alert, and in an unexpected move, they brought in an external consulting firm to audit the production line. On presentation day, Mark had no clear answers. His reports were full of gaps. That's when Eleanor Choi, the new global vice president, asked for an alternative perspective. I raised my hand. With a drive in my bag and a dossier organized in chronological order, I presented the real bottlenecks, the lost spreadsheets, the internal statements, and 3 viable alternatives for reorganization. I showed charts, simulated solutions, and even proposed a collaborative network between technical and creative teams that would increase productivity by 27% at zero cost. The room went silent. Mark tried to laugh, said my data was exaggerated and incomplete. But no one was listening to him anymore. Eleanor simply said, "Sora, I want you with me at the international headquarters. We have a bigger plan for you." Mark looked at me like he'd just swallowed his own tie. And in that moment, I knew. He tried to push me down out of vanity. And I just climbed the first step toward a role above his. The journey was only beginning. Per Gunter AO ChatGPT. The transfer to the international headquarters in Milan was discreet, almost silent, exactly the way I preferred. In the new city, I could walk unnoticed, speak little, and observe much. But my arrival was anything but irrelevant. Eleanor Choi introduced me as a silent revolutionary, someone who understood both the factory floor and the political intricacies of the industry. She gave me a clear mission: rebuild the broken link between creativity and execution. In no time, I was leading a pilot project that brought together teams from Korea, Italy, and Brazil. It was the biggest challenge of my career. But for the first time, I was at the center, not as a functional piece, but as the architect of a new structure. During the first few months, I barely slept. I adjusted to time zones, translated briefings, mediated cultural tensions. But I never complained. With each successful delivery, my name began circulating with respect. The spreadsheets I sent became templates. The reports I wrote became meeting agendas. For the first time, I didn't need to shout to be heard. But what truly cemented my position was a simple idea: create a living library of solutions, an internal repository where each team could record failures, fixes, and lessons learned in real time. Eleanor loved it. She said it could transform the company's culture. And then she gave me full freedom to implement the idea globally. Meanwhile, Mark was trying to reposition himself. He sent reports full of recycled buzzwords, created empty presentations with terms like synergistic excellence and flow recalibration. But the data didn't lie. His division was the only one not showing consistent growth. More than that, it was starting to lose talent. One of those talents was Olivia Marquet, Mark's former right hand. Tired of seeing her ideas suppressed, she requested a transfer and landed on my team. "I didn't come here to escape," she told me on her first day, looking straight into my eyes. "I came because I heard people are actually heard here." Little by little, women like Olivia began to find their space. And together, we began shaping a new kind of leadership. Silent, structural, precise. By the end of the first semester, the international pilot resulted in a 34% increase in efficiency and a 19% reduction in operational costs. Trade press started mentioning my name in specialized columns. But the most defining moment was still to come. At a conference in Paris, I was invited to moderate a panel on silent innovation in the creative chain. The panel was broadcast live to Harrow and Vale executives around the world. At the end, Eleanor stepped onto the stage, hugged me, and said into the microphone, "Sora Lin didn't just survive the system. She redesigned it." The audience gave a standing ovation. The next morning, I received an email titled, "Executive Restructuring, New Org Chart." There it was. My name, Global Director of Strategic Product Development. 2 lines above, Mark Halden. The same man who had tried to bury my career with fake smiles and petty moves would now have to report to the very structure I had built. I didn't reply to his email when it came. I didn't need to. The stitching was complete. And the new thread, irreversible. For months, I worked in silence in Milan, like an invisible seamstress shaping a new identity for the company. The pilot project became an internal benchmark. Teams that once competed began to collaborate. Standards were adapted with respect for each country's identity, and deliveries began arriving ahead of schedule. There was no fuss. There were results. But behind every result, there were sleepless nights, difficult decisions, and a discipline shaped since childhood. I began to notice that my presence unsettled certain departments. I received passive-aggressive emails, was left out of key meetings, and encountered forced smiles in the hallways. But I didn't flinch. I used each gesture as fuel. I turned rejection into method. And slowly, even the most skeptical began to bow to the consistency of the numbers. I wasn't there to compete with anyone's ego. I was there to deliver what no one else could. Transformation through listening. Mark Halden felt the impact from afar. His reports were being compared to mine. His divisions started losing budget. Invitations to conferences, once addressed to him, now came with my name. And he knew, even without anyone saying it, that this was just the beginning. The control he had over the company's narrative was slipping through his fingers. And no matter how hard he tried to discredit my initiatives, the ecosystem had changed. The culture responded to results, not to volume. When Eleanor summoned me to a meeting in Zurich with the Global Strategy Committee, I realized the game had changed levels. I was no longer just defending myself. I was redesigning the system. It felt like my personal story, the one stitched with invisible threads by generations of overlooked women, had finally found a fair stage. And I was ready. In that oval room, with 7 senior executives, I presented a model for creative decentralization. I proposed replacing the old pyramid structure with regional intelligence hubs linked through interdependent autonomy. I spoke about distributed responsibility, local recognition, and authentic innovation. The director's attentive eyes, the absence of interruptions, the focused silence at the end, everything indicated that I was finally being heard and taken seriously, not just as a technician, but as a strategist, as a leader. The following week, Eleanor called me in for a private conversation. Her words were direct. I need someone who can lead the transformation of the entire sector. Someone who understands both the details and the big picture. I want you as the Global Executive Director of Innovation and Production. I stayed silent for a few seconds. It was the position above Mark's, one level above the pain he had caused me. But I didn't smile with triumph. I smiled with peace. I accepted. Without hesitation. Without revenge in my heart. Only clarity. A clarity that would follow me to London. Because, yes, London was still part of my story. And I needed to go back, not to settle scores, but to close cycles with dignity. My first commitment as the new director would be a technical visit to the central units. And among them, of course, the old home. Harrow Vale, London. The place where it all began. The factory where my voice was once silenced. And where now, it would echo differently. I arrived as scheduled, accompanied by 2 members of the new executive team. I wore a light, sober suit, with a folded red handkerchief in the pocket, a discreet symbol of the strength I inherited from my mother. The same one she wore on hard sewing days. I walked firmly, without hurry, without fear. Mark came to meet me in the lobby. His face tense, his handshake cold. He still wore the mask of control, but his eyes revealed something else. Unease. Director Lin, he said, with a rehearsed voice. It's a pleasure to have you here. Manager Halden, I replied calmly. Shall we review the week's reports? During the meeting, there was no direct confrontation. I didn't need it. His discomfort said it all. He fumbled with the data, tried to justify declining metrics, blamed suppliers, all with a discourse that now sounded outdated, almost caricatured. When he finished, I thanked him, excused myself, and led the visiting directors to the creative department. My focus wasn't him. It was the system. There, I announced in a clear, firm voice, in front of the teams. Starting next quarter, we will begin a new phase of collaborative restructuring. Regional teams will have an active voice. And every professional involved in the processes will be credited by name in each collection. No idea will be erased again. I saw eyes well up, heard quiet sighs. Pattern makers looked at each other as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Some even smiled silently. And I understood once again that silence wasn't weakness. It was the thread of something far stronger: truth, ancestry, justice. As I left the room, I crossed paths with Mark again. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his gaze. There was something closer to restrained admiration, or perhaps regret. But I no longer needed that answer. I had my own. The real answer was in the hallways now reorganized under new leadership, in the names returning to the credits, in the pattern makers who whispered thank you when they saw me pass, and above all, in the feeling that I had rebuilt everything they once tried to take from me, without ever ceasing to be who I was. Discreet, steady, and essential. The journey, of course, wasn't over. There would still be resistance. There would still be attempts to erase paths. But now, I was the invisible needle stitching the company's entire future. A continuous thread of pain, strategy, and purpose. And no one would ever forget that. London felt smaller. Not physically, but in what it represented to me. Once, it had been the unreachable center of prestige. Now, it was just another station on the journey. Walking through the halls of Harrow Vale as the global executive director felt like stepping into a stage where I already knew every shadow, every silence, every unspoken gesture. The walls that once pressed in on me now felt like mere support structures, and the glances that once judged seemed to be searching for guidance. This time, however, I wasn't there to survive. I was there to rebuild. In the early days of the transition, I kept my ears open. I held meetings with each department. I sat with the pattern makers, listened to the suppliers, reviewed old contracts. I uncovered clauses that benefited companies tied to mark and verbal agreements that bypassed official procedures. Everything was documented. Everything was recorded. I visited the sewing floor, entered the fitting rooms, spoke with assistants, and even outsourced drivers. Every detail I once overlooked was now part of a larger fabric I needed to realign. I created a relational map of the company, a living diagram that showed connections, dependencies, inefficiencies, and potential. I used colors and lines as if I were drawing a pattern. Every poorly stitched knot from the past was a point of attention. Every silenced talent, an opportunity. It was like applying haute couture to management. With the data in hand, I called an internal assembly. There, in front of nearly 100 employees, I presented the new organizational chart. Lean, decentralized, and transparent. I established new anonymous reporting channels, promoted 3 team leaders who had been overlooked for years, and formalized a creative value pact with deadlines and goals. I instituted horizontal committees to review collections and gave voice to embroiderers, junior designers, and factory floor managers. As I spoke, I saw faces that once stayed lowered begin to rise. I saw timid smiles find space. For the first time, many of them saw themselves as protagonists, not invisible laborers in someone else's empire. There were tears, yes, but also light. It wasn't a revolt. It was an awakening. At the end of the meeting, a gray-haired seamstress approached me, eyes misty. "Miss Lin," she said in a soft voice, "I saw when it all began. I saw what they did to you. Thank you for coming back. For not forgetting us." I hugged that woman as if I were hugging my grandmother. She smelled of fabric softener and struggle. Her hands were worn from years of repetition, but her eyes held a renewed fire. It was in that embrace that I understood. My role wasn't just to change processes. It was to restore connection. Meanwhile, Mark Halden remained in his position, but not for long. Eleanor had initiated a formal transition process. He would be reassigned to a consultative role, without decision-making power. Not as a direct punishment, but as a dignified public closure to a cycle that needed to end. The internal memo used neutral language. But everyone understood. It was the end of an era. Mark asked to speak with me one last time. I agreed. We met in the same meeting room he once ruled like a throne. Now, the windows seemed wider, the table less imposing. He spoke in a rehearsed tone, justifying decisions, mentioning industry pressures and style differences. I didn't counter. I simply listened. And in the end, I said, "I don't need you to admit what you did, Mark. The system that protected you no longer exists. And that's enough." He nodded silently, perhaps out of pride, Perhaps out of relief. Perhaps out of shame. It didn't matter. The narrative had changed hands. I left that room with a lightness I hadn't expected to feel. The weight was no longer mine. And the future now had new stitches, stronger, more humane. The following week, we received an invitation to present the decentralization model at the World Textile Innovation Conference in Seoul. Eleanor chose me as the keynote speaker. And there, on a stage where so many voices had been silenced, my story became a symbol of something greater. I spoke about the anonymous seamstress, about the spreadsheets, about the silences that became strategy. The audience rose to their feet, not for me, but for what I represented. A new way to lead. Not about revenge, but about purposeful restructuring. About winning without corruption. About being heard without shouting. And above all, about remembering that no thread is ever too small to hold together a great transformation. Returning to London for the second time felt different. Less about me, more about the system I wanted to solidify. I was no longer the newcomer. I was the structure. I was the reference. The global headquarters now operated under a model that inspired other brands, and Harrow Vale had become its showcase. That morning, as I crossed the glass-fronted facade of the company, I noticed the subtle shift. The atmosphere had changed. There was expectation in people's eyes. The team no longer saw me as the survivor of an injustice, but as the architect of a new era. Discreet smiles, knowing glances, a quiet energy of hope filled the once austere hallways. My schedule was packed: meetings with investors, sessions with creative leadership, visits to technical departments. But I reserved 1 hour for something personal. I asked the internal communications team to give me all the anonymous messages received since the whistleblower channel was created. I read every story. And in many, I recognized pieces of my own past: silencing, erasure, exhaustion, creativity stifled by fear or rigid structures. I used those words as a compass. The following week, I created a new branch within the innovation sector, the Invisible Voices Lab, a unit dedicated to identifying overlooked talent, redesigning creative credit protocols, and structuring growth paths for those who had never had a career plan. I appointed a young Korean-Brazilian designer named Jaiwoo, a recent addition to the team, as its leader, someone who reminded me a lot of myself years ago. Her dedication was palpable, her shyness familiar, and her strength still unfolding. The lab's first weeks were intense. Instead of formal evaluations, we held listening circles. Instead of numerical goals, we introduced human impact indicators, recovered stories, emerging talents, recognition implemented. A young Syrian illustrator who worked in the supply room presented a print collection that moved the entire creative team. A 59-year-old Venezuelan seamstress, previously invisible, began leading internal workshops. Meanwhile, Eleanor and the board finalized Mark's transition into a consulting role. There was no spectacle, just an internal memo announcing a restructuring of roles and thanking him for his past contributions. Elegant.
Clean.
Irrevocable. Mark was moved to a distant office, with no team, no decision-making power. I rarely saw him, but one day, we crossed paths in the hallway. He walked alone, no briefcase, no rush. His steps hesitant, like someone who no longer recognized the ground beneath him. He stopped in front of me and said, "I never thought you'd go this far." I replied with a soft smile. "I never needed you to." And I kept walking. The new cycle was marked by a landmark fashion show during Paris Fashion Week. Every look carried the name of the designer, the seamstress, and the pattern maker embroidered on the label. On the big screen during the final credits, names appeared one by one, until the audience stood and applauded. The aesthetic was sophisticated, but the soul of the show was collective. It was about hands, about origins, about invisible threads that hold the splendor together. And then the unexpected. My mother, who had never left Korea, appeared backstage with tears in her eyes. Eleanor had invited her as a surprise. She hugged me and, through tears, said, "You stitched your name into this world, without unraveling who you are." It was in that embrace that I understood. My story was never about defeating a man. It was about rewriting the entire fabric of the system that once protected him. It was about reclaiming voices that had been silenced, giving names to the hands that turn ideas into garments, bringing dignity where there was once invisibility. The following week, an international business magazine published a feature on me. The headline read, "The Woman Who Turned Silence into Leadership." Not for glamour, but for integrity. And now, that structure had new threads, stronger, more honest, more human. Threads that didn't snap under pressure. Threads that knew where they came from, and where they could take the fashion world. It was the end of a cycle, but the beginning of a legacy.